have the back of your head on display.
So a whole new step in your preparation in the morning.
Really, but I mean, he was so innocent when he was complimentary. I told Lisa, that's Millen. That's the back of her head. So that's one reason I avoided, I wasn't sure.
Oh, the camera's right behind you now.
That's Melanie.
If he pans, they'll be saying, that's Melanie.
So are we ready, Clay, or do you want to wait till that person shows up?
It's up to you.
Why don't we start and let that person slide in?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me the high sign when it's time.
It's time now.
Okay.
Go.
Hi, everybody. As you remember, can you hear me on the? This is Irene Burgess, Dr. Irene Burgess. I'm the Executive Director of the Andalusia Institute. And we are out here at Andalusia on a stunning, stunning evening. And we wish you were here with us. We do have some friends here, but we wish everybody else could be here with us. So we're doing the next best thing and having you join us via Facebook and via Zoom. Now, as always, before we have an event with Dr. Gentry, I've got some announcements to make. Among them is that unlike normally when we have our Zoom meetings, we ask you, I normally watch the Zoom and ask questions. Our friend Clay, who's doing our recording for us, is watching for questions. So occasionally we'll go to him and see if you have any questions. Feel free to post them and let us know about any questions you might have. And we will certainly have an audience here who feels like asking us questions. Tonight, we're really kind of excited that we are going to have a discussion with Dr. Bruce Gentry of Georgia College on his new book. Many of you have already seen the cover of this, The Better to See You With. Afterwards, he will be signing copies of this book. And then this is a retrospective of really a lifetime of working with Flannery O'Connor. But before we get to that discussion, I want to remind everybody, that April is Bruce Gentry Month at Andalusia Institute virtual events. And so April 21st at 4:30 and 7, Bruce Gentry will be doing a virtual talk on Revelation. And that will be a discussion which you are all invited to. And you'll learn a lot about what it means to be a warthog from hell, I think, yeah. There's also two other extra events that we're kind of excited about next week. One is on April 12th, and it's from 5 to 6:15. And Amy Alsnauer, who is a children's book writer, who is the author of The Strange Birds of Flannery O'Connor, which is a lovely, lovely children's book. Get it for the children on your list. Will be speaking at Georgia College at the Museum Education Room and as the 2022 Flannery O'Connor Memorial Lecture. And her title of her lecture is The Underground Springs of Flannery O'Connor's Work, Reflections from the Archives. And she has a lot of fascinating work with the juvenilia, what Flannery O'Connor wrote when she was young. It's so interesting. Then on April 14th from 7 to 8:15, Sarah Gordon, once again, Bruce, it does
Show and tell.
Sarah Gordon, who is Professor Emerita here at Georgia College, will be doing a reading from her new book of poems, The Lost Thing. And that also will be in the Museum Education Room, and it will be live streamed on Facebook, and perhaps even on Zoom. And we have cupcakes. Ooh.
Don't you
Cupcakes
wish
and
you were
book
here?
signing. What more could we
What more
want?
could you want?
So welcome, everybody. And let's just start out with Bruce. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how the book came to be, and then maybe read some from it and let us know kind of what it's about.
Okay. I wanted to start with one of the epigraphs from one of the articles. It's a quote from Flannery O'Connor that you find in The Habit of Being. I relish the idea of being read by scholars. You know, we talk so much about how Flannery dislikes literary critics that, you know, we need to think about the other side of that every once in a while. How did the book come about? I turned my dissertation into a book right at the beginning of my teaching career. And after that, I'd publish an article once in a while. I would try to do other things besides O'Connor, and I'd keep thinking of something, oh, I would really ought to write something about that. And they got published, and they got published, and they got published over the years and the decades. And I wasn't really planning on having a book like this, but the story is that, gosh, I'm lucky that Mark Jolly, who runs Mercer University Press, brought his son out to the farm, and the gift shop, thank you gift shop, sold them a copy of my dissertation book. And as they're driving back to Macon, the son says to his father, why don't you publish this guy? So Mark Jolly calls me up and says, do you have a book? And I cleverly said, no, that's not what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say, of course, I have all these articles that I've written, and they could be assembled into a book. Well, I did eventually get around to saying that to him and said, well, I have like 3 new articles that haven't been published yet, and 17, I guess it is, older ones. Fine, send it to us. So, hey, I'm giving an order like that. I got busy and sent it to them, and it was the easiest production of a publication ever. Until, of course, I got to the indexing part, which is hell always. And I took the easy way out. Mary McGulick is here, and she wrote a real index for her book that just came out. And I can look at that and I can say, that is a real index. Congratulations. My index is, okay, just names of people who are going to pick up the book and say, am I mentioned in this book? And I always imagine that somebody is about to teach something by Flannery O'Connor, and they're going to look at this book and say, well, is it going to help me with that story? So I wanted to tell them which pages they should look at. And there are 1,000 other things you could put into an index, and it was still quite the big job. But this is gravy. This is a gift. This is a nice thing. I got to go back and look at things and change a little something here and there and update something once in a while, and put everything in the latest MLA, which will be out of date next week probably. But we did the updating.
Year.
You give it a year, and they'll have the 12th edition of the MLA handbook out. So I'll read you some little bits before I get the tough questions, before this turns into the dunking booth thing that we always talk. We've always talked about fundraising for Andalusia Institute. They're going to put me in a dunking booth, and people who've known me for years will be able to come.
And he's gladly agreed to it.
And I'll gladly agree to that. Okay. So one of the new parts is the introduction, of course. And here I'll just read you the opening lines. The greatest benefit from reading criticism about the works of Flannery O'Connor may be that it shakes up any reader who is serious about figuring out how reading O'Connor is valuable, useful, pleasurable, even therapeutic. O'Connor challenges us with satirical plots that look simple enough, but her novels and stories are also delightfully complex, always promising and delivering additional provocations. As we feel and think our way through repeated readings, we may be tempted to settle in with some of our conclusions to get comfortable, but O'Connor always offers fresh questions about things that matter to us, and good criticism can help the fiction do its work. While the contents of this volume were composed with great commitment, and while I hope that my claims are well supported, my goal is not to create converts to my way of thinking through the spelling out of a grand overview of exactly what O'Connor's works should mean to us all. Rather, I hope that portions of what is presented here will be helpful to any reader who is intent upon figuring out how to create the most valuable version of O'Connor. Yeah, I'll keep going because I like this next bit. Individual pieces in the collection, pieces written over approximately 30 years, may and do contradict each other. But I didn't fix that. I hope that those contradictions might open up the space so that an attentive reader can return once again to the fiction with fresh strategies for arriving at personal conclusions. For years, I have required that if students in my O'Connor course, and I will be doing one last time this fall, if they read any of my writing about O'Connor, they must disagree with me when they write their research papers. Few of my students have had any trouble with that requirement, and I find it generally fascinating to learn how my students go beyond and against my claims. I continue to create my version of O'Connor, and she continues to elude me. The whimsical title of this collection, based on the words of the Big Bad Wolf, is intended to suggest that I do not think my ways of looking at O'Connor are authoritative. I wasn't sure what to do with an introduction, so I kind of wrote 5 and just strung them together. And here's the second one, which I also rather like. It's the one about whiteness and race. Reviewing my writings during a time in which there are renewed calls for racial justice, and a time in which O'Connor's racial attitudes are being freshly scrutinized, I find my attitudes undergoing some adjustment. I'd never thought all that much about my own white privilege, even though going to Little Rock Central High School, the Little Rock Central High School building for kindergarten during the desegregation crisis of the late 50s should have made me more thoughtful. Tuition at the University of Arkansas and at the University of Texas was close to free in my time, and I just took that for granted as, of course, what I deserved. So I had the ability to complain that I had to pay over $3,000 for a year of graduate school at the University of Chicago. It's amazing what one can talk oneself into believing, especially if it boosts one's self-esteem. I used to say that my job is a matter of working for Flannery O'Connor, of doing whatever I think she would want. My respect for O'Connor remains immense, and I thank her for a career filled with learning about literary pleasure, but my attitude toward O'Connor has undergone an adjustment. Here's a thought experiment. What if we turn back on O'Connor, one of her famous criticisms of James Baldwin? What if someone were to say the following? About the whites, the kind I don't like is the philosophizing, prophesying, pontificating kind, the Flannery O'Connor kind. Very ignorant, but never silent. O'Connor can tell us what it feels like to be a Catholic white woman who did not often leave her Middle Georgia farm, but she tries to tell us about everything else too. Now, here, just doing a little bit of substitution of names and races, I have applied to O'Connor her words against James Baldwin in a 1964 letter she wrote to Marriott Lee, which does appear in both major collections of O'Connor's letters. Is such a critique of O'Connor justified? O'Connor could be very modest about her intellect and her philosophizing and her prophesying. It's O'Connor's critics, fans like me, I'm afraid, who've insisted on promoting her opinions on everything as universally valuable and even prophetic. Still, O'Connor could be heard by powerful people and be taken quite seriously despite her outspoken modesty, in part because she was white. And it is because of white privilege that she can afford to be so modest. I'm not trying to demote O'Connor's status as a writer. O'Connor's voice may ultimately be more powerful in the long run as we pay more attention to her race, class, gender, and disability, even as we note her errors about race. But my self-imposed job description now is to try to provide what O'Connor, the writer, needs, not so much what I think O'Connor, the human being, might want. Another thing I wanted to say. How am I doing on time?
Okay.
About there are a lot of people I want to thank for the career, and it's in the parts of the book that people don't always often look at. But I'll run through some of that. I'm really grateful to the University of Indianapolis. I'm really glad my wife hired me at the University of Indianapolis way back when, so I could escape the third of a garage I was living in, and all the opportunities I was given there, and then thank you, Georgia College, for giving me a wonderful second career. It's been great. I never thought I was going to be a grant writer, but golly gee, Georgia Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities, they've fallen for it several times now, and it's been very nice. Sarah Gordon's coming next week. She was the perfect predecessor in her job, always supportive, never in the way. As I was trying to do this fascinating job I've been doing here for years. Nancy Davis Bray and the Special Collections people have been a cultural resource for everybody in O'Connor Studies for years. I've always had partners to work with. John Cox and Robert Donahue helped me out with the NEH Institutes. And now I'm ever so grateful for this Irene Burgess over here for starting Andalusia Institute and giving me a life during COVID. What would we have done without you? For one thing, you've made the book club survive these last couple of years and prosper. It's been great. I'm thankful to the people who put me in a movie, Elizabeth Kaufman and Mark Bosco. Who knew that I gave them so many chances to leave me on the cutting room floor, and they didn't, and they never took it. Every time I saw another rough cut, I said, this is going to be the one where they've decided to just let me go. I'm still in there, my goodness. And more and more people. It's been a good gig. And oh, by the way, I have all these co-authors. Some of the pieces of the article come out of conversations I had with people who were interested in O'Connor, and I would every once in a while. I guess it was always my idea, you mean to work with you on turning that into an article? So Chuck Puckett, who is used to work in the School of Education, we worked together on an article. Michael Faulkner and I kept talking about one of his papers he wrote for me in a graduate course. My former chair, Elaine Whittick, and I worked on a topic for a long time that turned into an article. After she took my Flannery O'Connor course twice and wrote the papers, my goodness, Bob Wilson, who knows everything about Milledgeville, helped me with some details on some stuff. And I want to mention Patricia Martell. When you look at this cover, my first thought is, well, isn't this a white book? And I love the cover, okay, but I did say, isn't this a really white book by an old white guy? So I was kind of pleased when they decided to use for the inside flaps parts of an artwork that was created by Patricia Martell up in Milwaukee, and she sent it to me, and I said, I'm going to figure out some way to use this. She read the article about race that I wrote when Avis Hewitt insisted that I had to write an article about race. That's how I remember it. And I started with the way Flannery O'Connor talks about colors, skin colors and other colors. And she just, filled the canvas with daubs of colors with the words the colorful wording that Flannery uses. And I found it quite charming, and it seems to me the perfect complement to the cover of the albino peacock on the front. And finally, I want to thank my wife for putting up with me and hiring me, and every once in a while having an idea about O'Connor that she would always state in a kind of offhand fashion that I would almost immediately write down and think about and steal. Every once in a while I give her credit, but thank you, Alice, for your help with this. How's that? That's more than 15 minutes. Okay.
I think
All right,
we're
okay. Okay.
Yeah, you spent a lot of time praising me, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's right. As long as I praise you.
Well, the one thing that interested me in what you read, and I wrote this down too in my notes, is can you talk a little bit more about the line you use? And you've told me this in person as well. Mm-hmm. My self-imposed job description now is to try to provide what O'Connor the writer needs, not so much what O'Connor the human being might want. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, what do I know about what she would want? But
that's a favorite parlor you.
Yeah,
yeah.
Right. My main answer to that is she needs to be taken seriously by English departments in graduate schools. My business is to try to make people want to focus a career on O'Connor. And that's not an obvious thing. Mm-hmm. We interviewed that professor at Cornell that time who said, "Oh, yes, I love Flannery O'Connor. It's a shame nobody reads her anymore." And you go through the lists of O'Connor scholars that we publish and who are on the editorial advisory board. How many of those professors teach at schools where they give PhDs? I think I can name 2. I don't know how to explain that. I just think O'Connor still is in some danger of being relegated to the freshman English anthology. Mm-hmm. She's the sort of person you read when you're an undergraduate and then you grow up. And you read real literature later and you forget about her. And I've always thought, well, okay, that's a good goal. And the NEH institutes where you were grabbing people, hopefully fairly early in their careers, with years to go, and telling them that, yeah, you can do more of this, and you can use O'Connor in lots of teaching situations, and you can publish on O'Connor. That has worked. Mm-hmm. And, we've got, I would say probably 30 people who have been to Milledgeville for boot camp in July, living in a dorm, and they're still in touch regularly and writing about O'Connor and teaching O'Connor, and that's what Flannery needs, And the snarky part of my comment, what would Flannery want that I don't want to give her, is she might want her comments about her fiction to be even more authoritative than they already are. God knows she's bossed us all around for forever about how to read her. It's better for her reputation, it's better for her standing, her status in the academy, that every new approach to literature, every new set of questions people want to ask about a short story, it should be possible to ask those questions about O'Connor. Mm-hmm. And on that score, I think she's doing pretty well, and not necessarily because of anything I'm doing, but I'm rooting for the people who find new approaches to O'Connor always. Yeah.
What I think is interesting is when you talk about your career and you talk about it in the course of the book and how you've changed. And one of there's 2 interesting aspects of it. One of it is that you say, and I'm quoting now, I think, looking back on my book now, your first book, yeah. I think my major blind spot was gender.
Yeah.
And then you quickly credit Alice
Alice.
Freeman for being the one to open your eyes to the fact that there's this whole gender issue going on in the work. And one question I have is, can you talk a little bit about the gender issues in Flannery O'Connor and how that has changed over your time when working with her? And then the other question I have to ask, I'll ask
You may,
after you
okay,
answer that.
after I have forgotten the first question. Well, the major thing I contradict myself about in the book, in 2 different articles, is who's the narrator? And I gave up a long time ago on the notion that it's O'Connor. And there's one article in which I say it's some really patriarchal male that she wants us to get over and question. And then there's another article in which I say it's her mama. That's the voice who's telling us all these stories. And the more I think about that, the more I like it. You know, I like the idea that at the end of every day, they're sitting there at the dining room table, and Regina is talking about all the terrible things that happened on the farm today, and Flannery's sitting there nodding and thinking about how she can use that in the future. But that would lead to maybe the voice that's telling the stories sounds kind of like Regina telling Flannery about what just happened and how Regina feels about it. And of course, Flannery has a lot in common with her mama. Don't we all? A woman is her mother. That's the main thing. Yeah. So that was half of an answer of a question. What's the other half?
And we'll go back to the sort of narrative voice issues
Okay.
and gender and stuff. But the other thing, and you know, you refer to yourself derogatorily as an old white guy, which, you know, you are.
I used to not be. But,
Now you are.
it's fine.
And the idea that, you know, the old white guys we grew up with in grad school would never have said, oh, my wife taught me about my craft.
Oh, yeah. Right, that wasn't-
And what does that say that, is something really interesting you're saying about how personal the act of reading, the act of interpreting, all of that has to do, it's a relationship
well,
in a
yeah.
certain way.
And when I started working on Flannery O'Connor, it was a very intellectual exercise.
Uh-huh.
And now it's more about other parts.
Yeah.
It's more about the heart and the guts and there's more emotion in it. It's a different kind of exercise. And you know, some of that has to do with thinking about gender. What's it like for the female characters in these stories? And it's easy for a guy to read the stories over and over and over and not think about that a whole lot, and then to have somebody else, you know, just mention that you might give another look to some of the other characters. Yeah, that can have a big effect. Yeah. What am I not getting to in that?
I think
in that
one of the
question?
things that you end up talking a lot about, and that you use sort of as an example of that, is your discussion of the growth or changes in how you see A View of the Woods.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, when I wrote my dissertation, that was a story about the old man. And when I started working on turning my dissertation into a book, the person who runs University Press of Mississippi said, well, you need to cut it down to 250 double-spaced pages. Well, my dissertation was about 50% longer than that. So I immediately said, okay, I got to do this quick, and I got to cut. First thing I thought of was, I don't really understand A View of the Woods. I'm not getting that right. and I didn't know why, but I knew there was something wrong. And I just tossed that out. And there was another story I just decided, I'm not going to talk about this yet, the Comforts of Home, I think it was. And that helped. You know, you leave chapters out and you save pages right away. And I came back to them later when I was a little more confident. And now, that's the story that gets more painful and more about the women every time I reread it. It's about the torture, the abuse of a little girl, and it's about a man who hates his daughter and would do anything to torture her. And to think that I wasn't noticing that for years, that's a big shift. Mm-hmm. And I've never doubted. I've never thought, I'm really overdoing, this little detail and this little detail and this little detail. I'm thinking, no, Flannery wants me to go through this, wants me to read it one way and then realize that I've been an idiot and I should read it in a totally different way and see how far I can take a new reading. And it's a story that's totally painful. I mean, it just hurts to revisit that story. I tell my students, if you can get through the lame winter first and a view of the woods, okay, the worst is over, and the rest of it's sweetness and light compared to that. Yeah, people get killed, but those are the two.
You don't feel quite as bad.
It won't be as bad when they get killed as it is in those two stories. And that encapsulates how things have changed. But the other major thing I would say, how my attitudes changed over the years. That when I wrote my dissertation, I was taking notes on these people are saved and these people are damned. Let me explain why. And as I, have thought about all these characters and tried to inhabit their weird little worlds from time to time, I think Flannery is really open-minded and ecumenical, and she's trying to find some loophole for everybody. Well, there might be 5 exceptions.
You'll have to
A
tell us which
loophole
ones.
for just about everybody. So she's going to save them all. And how do you reconcile that? You got this demonic narrator, you got this voice who just loves tearing people to shreds and watching them, bleed to death. And then you've got these plots that seem to end with something more positive than just vicious satire. Mm-hmm. And how do you work that out? And I don't know if Flannery even expected herself to try to figure it out. I mean, I think she may have just thought, all I got to do is figure out how to finish the story. That line she says about Greenleaf, all I'm worrying about as I write this story is how am I going to get that bull's horn into that woman's chest. And make and it's a real happy story too, by the way. Sweetness and light. It's just happy. We laugh and laugh.
Well, who are the characters you don't think are saved?
Oh, the father in A View of the Woods. Mm-hmm. And the crazy thing is that there's the alternate ending of The View of the Woods where Flannery tries to save him. And I say, thank you, Flannery, for not ending the story with that paragraph. Thank you for erasing that and ending it with other horrible things, that are more palatable. Probably the racist in the Violent Bear It Away, the guy who rapes Tarwater. Yeah, he's probably such a devil figure that we're not supposed to think anything is good is going to happen to him later on. I'm still putting Manly Pointer in that category, even though he's Flannery's boyfriend. And she said, you know, not to worry, you're not him. Oh, yes, he is. And she had real mixed emotions about what she turned into Manly Pointer. But I still think that story just leaves him as a kind of flat character, symbolic of something she's rejecting. And we're not supposed to think about Manly Pointer too long. We're supposed to get back to worrying about poor Holga.
Okay.
And, you know, let's think her through in every possible way and identify with her. What do you do when you encounter such a figure as Manly Pointer? And there are plenty of Manly Pointers out there.
Okay.
Yeah. And there are others too, and I can't think of who they are right now.
What about the grandmother?
Oh yeah, she's saved. You know, I had a real fundamentalist graduate student a few years ago, brilliant person, who said she didn't like. She didn't say she didn't like. She said she loved everything. But
This, by the way, if you can't hear on
okay,
the
sorry.
streaming, is the grandmother and
the good man's heart, yeah, is the grandmother in A Good Man's Heart finds. Sure, but I do remember having a student who said, and she's right, Flannery cheats when she says she's getting to the moment where somebody's supposed to have a religious revelation, and she sold everybody on the idea that they're having a religious revelation. What they're really doing is family. And all the grandmother actually does, I'm channeling my student now. All the grandmother really does is she feels for a child for a minute. And it's got nothing to do with God. And then I go and I look in the letters, and Flannery O'Connor says to somebody in a letter, the grandmother isn't thinking about God. So, you know, 10,000 critical articles about how the grandmother is saved at the end of A Good Man is Hard to Find can be kind of questioned, but I think Flannery lets everybody off the hook. Yeah, she's not so tough.
What about the misfit?
Oh yeah, he's probably okay. But see, Flannery says what the grandmother does to the misfit is going to cause him to become the prophet he was always meant to become. And then she says, but that's another story. Oh, please. 10,000 articles are written to show us that we always knew that the misfit was on his way to becoming a prophet. Well, I'm not so sure. But he's really interesting, and I would say, you know, one way I can maintain this belief that Flannery's saving everybody is that she abandons characters. She doesn't tell you what happens to them. And, you know, I would say Wiseblood is full of really interesting, messed up characters that I used to think Flannery really, really, really dislikes them. And now I think she's just saying, okay, I'm not going to talk about them anymore. You can decide for yourself. I mean, I keep thinking about, how old is Sabbath Lily at the end of Wiseblood? She's in her teens. She hadn't started her life. Let's not believe the 10,000 critical articles that talk about her as a devil. Am I exaggerating? Just a little bit.
A little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah. Okay. What else?
Well, you know, to me that's kind of interesting, because one of the things, you know, in my year and a half, 2 years getting to know you as an critic, is you use the language of the theological critics, you know, who's saved, who's damned, et cetera, but in many ways you resist the urge to the theological approach. Can you talk a little bit about how that you've unrolled that as the years have gone by?
I have made a career out of making everybody think I'm not on their side. The theological critics think I'm not one of them, and then the people who are totally anti-religion in their approach to O'Connor, you know, like the board member who said, I never want to read another article that talks about religion, they think I'm too soft on it. You know, I think Flannery thought in theological terms, she thought in religious terms, and the theology gave her permission to think about a bunch of other things too that aren't easily translatable into religious principles. So it helps to think about it some. But I'm no theologian. I'm just a spectator on the side, and I watch people split hairs over theological, philosophical points. And my tendency is to say, have a fun time. Let me know when you've figured it out, and give me the short version of what this adds up to. So every once in a while, I write something that I think is trying to do a kind of religious reading of O'Connor. There are exactly 2 articles I have written in the last 40 years that try to do that. But I think, well, I'm more like the outsider who needs to find a way to make some use of what I don't know. How can I say that? That I might be able to see things because I don't have on the glasses that other people are wearing. And I want to be original. I want to say something. I want to say something different from what I've read over and over and over. And sometimes not having learned things that I know we should all learn, but sometimes my ignorance is useful. I mean, I don't say that in class, but yeah, I do believe that. Sometimes that's true.
I want to return to the idea of the narrative voice, because that's something that, from the very start, when you were talking about Bakhtin in your early work, and from then on, you've talked a lot about narrative voice and how it kind of shifts around. And I love when you just said that you thought Ms. Regina was the narrative voice, because then I got the thought, okay, so if Carolyn Gordon wants Dr. Johnson to be the narrative voice, it's Dr. Johnson and Miss Regina.
Dr. Johnson and Regina Klein O'Connor. Yeah, that's the narrator.
Can you talk a little bit about the narrative voice and sort of what it says about gender, what it says about...
Well, the main thing is just that if you start reading Flannery O'Connor and you think Flannery O'Connor is always the person who's talking to us, you can get through the stories and love them, and a lot of things become simpler if she's the one who's telling you the answers to all the questions and how you're supposed to interpret everything. How did this come about? At Texas, I was required to take a course that was about linguistics and literature, and one of the professors had just done a supervised a dissertation about free indirect style in Jane Austen. So we were all assigned to read the dissertation. And so that was my training in how to go through a text and ask myself at every turn, who's responsible for this next word? And the answer might be the narrator, the author, this character, that character, the other character, or any combination of the above. And 2 different people might own a word and think of it as meaning different things. And it's fuzzy, tricky, imprecise, but starting to look at literature that way was fun. And I was stumbling in the dark, trying to figure out how to talk about Flannery O'Connor that way for a long time, and then I was never assigned Bakhtin in a course. I sat in restaurants chatting with people in Comp Lit who were getting jobs translating Bakhtin text from Russian into English. And they would just talk about, well, this is great stuff. He says this, he says this, he says this, he says this. And then finally on my own, I read, some selected Bakhtin, and I thought, well, he's got ways of talking about stuff that I want to talk about. And the big thing is, can you talk yourself into the idea that the voice who's talking to you in a Flannery O'Connor story isn't telling you the truth? And it's much more fun to think through every passage by saying, well, what if this isn't the truth? What else might be going on here? I find myself frequently, as I'm preparing for book club, I find this happens over and over and over. I reread the last page of a short story, and I ask myself those questions again. And lately, it's been working. I say, well, that solves that problem at the end of that story, maybe, but it's not the author, it's not the narrator who's telling us that this is what's happening and we have to believe it. It's one of the characters. And we're getting a description of what's happening. As Andalusia's burning down, for example, at the end of A Circle in the Fire, I think, that's just that poor, troubled little girl thinking what's happening as the delinquent boys from Atlanta are setting a fire. Changes the story totally, makes the little girl, Sally Virginia Cope, makes her more important to the story, and gives you another way to consider interpreting what's going on at the end of the story. Playing this game with these texts does not lead you in any particular direction necessarily. It just gives you, half a dozen more questions to answer about every sentence you read. And Flannery O'Connor said, point of view runs me nuts. I don't know nothing about Flannery. I only did what my mentor, Carolyn Gordon, told me I had to do, and that she told her she wasn't very good at. O'Connor's a master.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe she didn't think about it, but what comes out
Works.
is really well done. And, when I go through manuscripts, I don't know that I see her working on fine-tuning that.
Mm.
It's not like she said, okay, now I have to work on my free and direct style today as I go over this manuscript for the 47th time. No, it just appears when it appears, and it's all very well done. Authority is always in question, and in one of these texts, and that's part of what makes it great.
So partially it's the authority of the narrative voice and the authority of the author is in question.
Is being questioned,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. One of Bakhtin's books is about Dostoevsky, and he says, what's great about Dostoevsky is that Dostoevsky allows the characters to take the book away from the author. And, I guess I think that. Sometimes he did that. I think O'Connor does it even more. And, she read Dostoevsky. Is that where she got it? Well, maybe. She did read a lot.
Yeah.
She did. She was always looking for what could she steal from other writers.
Well, before
Thank goodness.
I ask my next question, let's see if anybody out in the internet land or in our own audience has a question. Clay, no questions?
Not yet. Okay.
Okay. Anybody in the audience have a question or concern?
So what did you think of the PBS
Film.
feature? Yeah.
That's where I'm up.
That was,
Well,
American Masters.
Yeah.
And O'Connor was featured. as
well, I'm in it.
the
I talked 9 times and she didn't come out. I saw like 3 rough cuts, and I wrote long pages of fix this, fix this, fix this, fix this. You didn't do the second novel. You didn't do the third novel. Someday people are going to say these are major holes in your film. But on the other hand, I'm in it, and so I didn't lay it on too thick. It's a great film. You just keep right on doing what you're doing with that film. Yeah.
Mary?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with O'Connor these days as maybe
But you once were.
a long time ago. But is the narrator, it sounds like you're suggesting the narrator is sort of the same across most of the stories, but now you're reading, or maybe you used to, but now you're reading it differently.
Oh yeah, I think it varies. See, and that's another thing is that I think the tradition of O'Connor criticism says the narrator's always the same. It's Flannery O'Connor, and the more we get to know her, we'll know who's talking to us.
Oh, that's the canonical.
I think so. Yeah. It's so much fun to get to define, everybody else's opinions in 25 words or less. There are only thousands of O'Connor critics out there. Yes, Charlotte.
So you just said O'Connor likes to steal from other writers, and I really enjoyed the little anecdote in your book. And I don't know if that essay is maybe old, but I forget who it was. Someone had a dream that Flannery O'Connor was hiding the Carson McCullers side of herself in a closet. Tell me how Flannery stole from Carson McCullers, if there's parts that you haven't already.
Oh, well. Wise Blood is a reaction to The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Wise Blood is a reaction to Reflections in a Golden Eye. Flannery's first story is The Geranium is based on a scene in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I'm saying these things as facts because it's what I think, okay? Other people are not so inclined to see it. The number one answer to that is it's about the little girls. That McCullers is justly famous for paying close attention to the inner lives of, troubled young women. And Flannery seems to be picking up on that and using it as shorthand. Yeah, I think what's the term? The Harold Bloom thing, the anxiety of influence. Yeah. Flannery O'Connor stole everything she could steal from Carson McCullers, and then she had to insult Carson McCullers throughout her life because she'd borrowed so much from her. She had modeled herself.
She
Carson
doesn't
McCullers.
like authority, right?
She went to New York City and got rich and famous, and she was just this little girl from Georgia. How could Flannery O'Connor not have said, "I want to be another Carson McCullers. I have to figure out how to not just reproduce it." But of course, it was like, here's your career plan. Here's your role model. And then you have to figure out how you're not just another Carson McCullers. Well, she figured that out. She managed to tell us over and over and over that Carson McCullers couldn't write. Yeah, I guess that's my answer to that one. Thank you.
What scene is it in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter?
Oh, yeah. One of the names of characters, Dr. Copeland and Jake Blunt meet on a stairwell. The rest of the novel tells you they have total agreement about every issue, and they ought to form this interracial friendship. But they can't, and they can't, and they can't, and they can't, and they can't. And there are long scenes later on about why they can't, and they fight with each other. Flannery's first story is about a white man and a black man who meet each other on the stairs, and what we hear is about what the old white man fantasizes about as he's looking at this black man that he's encountering in New York City. And there's not really much, except, hundreds of years of racism, to say these people couldn't be friends with each other. And the story's kind of tragic because there's a possibility there that ain't going to happen. And I think, well, it's just taken, an idea that McCullers dealt with in a page, and then making a whole story out of it in Flannery O'Connor style. She added the N-word more times than she ever used the N-word in any story. I guess that was her way to make it distinctive. But yeah, I think she was very influenced by Carson McCullers in young female characters, in male characters, in plots. Yeah, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of that going on, and then she covered her tracks. I like to point out to people that if you go back and you look at what people were writing in literary criticism about Carson McCullers in like the 60s, there was a lot of religious interpretation of Carson McCullers. Well, then the world changed when Flannery was having her way and thinking she's the only religious writer there ever was, and suddenly people have stopped talking about Carson McCullers having any concern about religion whatsoever. Well, there may be other things that are more important in Carson McCullers than religion, but there's kind of a war between the McCullers people in Columbus and the O'Connor people that we just think we live in totally separate worlds. Well, that's not, that's not necessary. What people do with Carson McCullers nowadays is they do psychoanalytic gender studies, and they could be doing that with O'Connor, but there aren't that many people who want to go there with O'Connor, and the religious approach to O'Connor is what I think still continues to dominate over here in our camp, and it'll probably be good for O'Connor when there is more theoretical, psychoanalytic, readings of her stories someday. Yeah, we're not there yet.
Where are we going with Flannery O'Connor? What's next?
Well, I answered that in here. Now I've forgotten the answer. There was a guy who wrote a book about, here's the history of O'Connor criticism, and he summarizes everything. And then he says, what should you be doing with O'Connor? And what we should be doing and what we have done in the past overlap almost not at all. I mean, his main answer is style. Well, nobody can define it, but that we need to be studying her as a great stylist, and that the greatness isn't necessarily in what she says, but just in how it's written, how it's put together. And that's her, his claim was that that's her long-lasting basis for fame. But eco-criticism, disability studies, there are lots of other things, you name it. I published our first Flannery O'Connor Review Marxist article about O'Connor a couple of years ago, and I think, we haven't really done that on her yet.
There's a lot about class.
A lot about class, and we haven't begun. We're just scratching the surface, thinking about O'Connor's sense of class. Her line is about, I'll put people in the stories that I would never allow in the house. I mean, Regina wouldn't allow them in the house, but even Flannery wouldn't allow them in the house. What a thing to say about your characters. That the people who are worth writing about are the people I don't want to have anything to do with in real life. And, that has all sorts of ramifications. A simple, innocent-sounding little snobby remark like that, we could be playing around with that for a very long time. We used to joke about the fact that upstairs there was all this junk.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's just old farm records. Who was it who said that to me? Mm-hmm. Nobody cares. And I think, now I realize, well, where are they? Somebody is going to want to pick apart this farm someday. I mean, it's starting, but we are totally at square one trying to figure out what happened here. What was it about O'Connor's family that made them want to take on a plantation, and with all that carries with it, and run a dairy farm with hired help? What were people paid? What was it like in one of those shacks down there by the pond? Flannery owned rental property because Regina said every woman ought to own property so she can have her own income. Yeah, how much did Flannery charge in rent? And who was she renting to? And where were these houses? I want to see them, and I don't know. And I think somebody else has got to, do 16 dissertations about this topic. And there are lots of little gold mines sitting around. I think so. I think she might have owned property in Savannah too.
Yeah,
I'm not sure where it was, but
every time I look at certain areas of the town,
I think this is what Flannery owned. She's probably a slum landlord.
Well, that's the interesting thing.
I didn't say that, by the way.
That's the interesting think about being in Milledgeville? You know, you've had a very unique perspective in a way that the Flannery O'Connor scholar who lives in New England does not have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never really thought of Flannery O'Connor as a Southern writer. I didn't think of myself as a person who does Southern studies. I just thought, oh, I'm interested in this one author, and yeah, I guess I'm from the South. Some Georgians tell me I'm not from the South. Arkansas isn't the South. Okay. But then I moved to Milledgeville, and everybody's got a story about Flannery or Regina, and you drive down the highway, and here's Hopewell Baptist Church, and the names of O'Connor things just keep popping up all over the place. And then you visit Central State Hospital, God help us all, and you say, well, it's all about that. And so I've become much more interested in the local detail, and living here all these years now makes me realize how different my perspective on her was when I had never been here. I mean, I'd been here for 3 weeks to do dissertation work, but I didn't really get much of a sense of the region. I'd never been to Georgia. It was a whole new thing. My mother said one time, if Alice thinks we're Southerners, wait until she gets a load of those Georgians. And I think there are times when Georgians do seem more Southern than me. Yeah.
Well, any final questions?
How are we doing? We're done. Hey, it's 8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock.
And I had nothing to say. We had hadn't prepared anything.
I didn't ask any of the questions.
You didn't ask any of the time. She was going to ask me why I beat up on the chair of the English department at Berkeley so many times in my articles. Sorry.
What has he done to you?
He hadn't done anything.
I wanted to hear some conference stories.
No, I had never met the man. Yeah. Frederick Cruz wrote an article in which he said Flannery
was not a good writer. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Land.
We'll get back to that another time.
Speaking of the South, I was really struck when I watched the PBS.
Yeah.